MARCUS-PHANTASTICUS.
You are listening to MARCUS-PHANTASTICUS.
I want to talk to you a little bit about theories of truth. And there's a reason for that, and the reason is that I want to make a distinction between two kinds of knowledge. And before I do that, I want to talk about the multiple ways that you can determine whether or not something is true, or whether something is factual. It's a much more difficult task than you might think, because it's easy to think that there's only one way of defining true, but that's not the case as far as I can tell. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk to you about how things might be true. You know, Darwin had this theory back in the late 1800s, which you're no doubt all aware of. And it was basically predicated on two fundamental axioms. And the first axiom was that there's natural variability in a population. And that was later discovered to be associated with genetic variability. And that genetic variability could transform as mutations do that. That was, in some sense, a later addition to Darwin's theory. And then the natural environment selects the organism that's most suitable to the current environment, all things considered, so that it can propagate, right? And then whatever propagates moves to the next generation, and the same process occurs again. Okay, now, there's a variety of complications about that theory that I'm going to lay out a little bit. When the Victorians first got a hold of this theory, they kind of thought that it meant that there was a natural hierarchy, right? That as evolution progressed, it progressed, and that higher organisms followed in the trail of lower organisms. And so, in some sense, even though it wasn't a natural or necessary presumption, the idea of a hierarchy of value, in some sense, was still part of Darwinian theory. So we could say, well, human beings are, evolution has led over its billions of years to us, and we're far more complicated than simple creatures. So it seems like there's a process, at least, of increasing complexification going on, and maybe that has something to do with increased value. We're more fit. Now, modern evolutionary biologists take issue with this because they don't really think that there is any directionality in evolution. And after all, there's still plenty of one-celled organisms around. In fact, there are more one-celled organisms in your body than there are your own cells by a huge margin. So the idea that there's a necessary direction in evolution, going from simple to more complex, is not formally true, except that obviously there are much more complex organisms than there were around a couple of billion years ago, and so there does seem to be some directionality in some cases, and it's not exactly obvious why that is. So the reason I'm telling you that is because it's not self-evident that creatures, as they evolve, become more fit, so to speak. And so what evolutionary theory seems to be about at a deeper level is something like a dance between the environment and the organism. So the environment keeps transforming, and it does that unpredictably. I wouldn't say randomly, but it does it unpredictably, or does it unpredictably to an unpredictable degree. Because some things that are true today are going to be true tomorrow, but other things aren't, and you don't know which one of those are going to shift. Now, I think if you want to get a practical idea of how the environment moves around, past performance to predict the future, in fact, there's no evidence that you can do it. People don't want to take responsibility for making mistakes, and you can't keep up with fundamentals. So you can think of the environment that way. It's this thing that's dancing around, and some elements of it are more stable than others. But lots of things can't be relied on from one moment to another, and you don't know what direction it's going to turn. So the way that life deals with that is by producing a plethora of variants and basically letting anything that doesn't work die. So evolution requires an awful lot of death. You know, and there's ideas that what we've done to some degree is we've internalized the evolutionary process because we can invent fictional representatives of ourselves, right, which would be our potential future selves, and we can run simulations of the environment and kill off all those potential future selves that don't look like they would actually survive. And that's really what we think about as thinking. Okay, so how would you define reality? If you had to come up with a definition of what constituted real, how would you go about doing it? And I would say the way the West does this, there's a schizophrenic element to it, a split element. There's an incoherence in it. And so think about it this way, like our basic presumptions about the world are materialistic, right? Now, and I would say that those materialistic assumptions were basically laid down at the beginning of the scientific endeavor. And there's some rules about what things are in reality, and the rules are something like, well, things are made out of littler things, and then if you go all the way down to the level where the littlest thing possible is, well, that's where you find the fundamental constituent elements of reality. And so and matter is detectable by the senses, and it's intersubjectively detectable. So you can detect something with your senses fundamentally, or with the extension of your senses. You can describe how you went about detecting it. Other people can duplicate that, and then they can report what they detect, and if the reports are similar, then we assume that that thing is real. So in some sense, it's what our senses already do, right? Because our senses triangulate in a sense. So how do you figure out if something's real? Well, if you can see it, you know, that's pretty good. But it's better if you can see it and hear it. And it's better yet if you can see it and hear it and touch it. And maybe it's better if you can see it and hear it and touch it and taste it, and so forth. And you know, we've evolved these sensory systems that are quite different from a qualitative perspective. And if they all report the same thing, then we believe we have a pretty reasonable chance of actually believing that that thing is there. And then with science, we've actually extended that capacity because we don't just use the senses of one person. We use our senses in a rigorous and collective manner, and that reports to us the nature of what we've come to call the objective world. And then we say, well, accurate descriptions of the objective world are true. It's like, you know, that's a good theory. And you can also certainly see its objective utility. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. It's pragmatic utility, because when you play by the rules of science, it appears that your power expands, right? So that's another reason why we think it's true. You run through these routines, and then all of a sudden you could do things you couldn't do before. And that's a different criteria of truth, right? That's more like a criteria of usefulness, and a practical usefulness, because you would think too that, and this is why Jung thought that science was actually embedded inside a narrative, in a deeper narrative. You know, we wouldn't be doing science if we didn't think it was useful for something, right? And then you might think, well, useful for what? And then, well, what would you say? Maybe you suffer less because of science, maybe you live longer because of science, maybe you find life more interesting, you could do a more diverse range of things, whatever.